Today, we have invited three distinguished speakers who will present how our history, our societal perception, and our institutional policies affect all people's abilities to achieve Dr. King's dream. We have Associate Justice Charles Johnson from the State Supreme Court. Since 1991 he served. Also the co-chair of the Washington State Minority and Justice Commission, and he also co-chaired the 2004 Task Force on Civil Equal Justice Funding. He has received numerous awards, including in 2012 the John McAway Legal Educator Award, based on his dedication to the principles and ideals of integrity, compassion, courage, and professional service. He co-founded and maintains the Justices Scholarship to the Hispanic Academic Achievers Program that provides scholarships to eligible students in the Tri-City area. Barbara Rofkar has an MA in Cultural Anthropology and is an instructor in Global Studies at Western Washington University. In addition to her peacemaking work in the Middle East, she has been one of the long-time lead coordinators of the Whatcom Human Rights Task Force and has been instrumental in organizing the Martin Luther King Human Rights Conference each year in our community. Ms. Rofkar is a founding member of the Whatcom Dispute Resolution Center, and in 2014 she was honored with the Howard Harris Lifetime Peacemaker Award. Dr. Vernon Damani Johnson is a professor of political science at Western Washington University. He served on the advisory committee to Reverend Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign in Washington State in 1988. He also served on the steering committee of the Washington State Rainbow Coalition from 88 to 92. When the militia movement swept into the region in the 90s, Dr. Johnson helped found the Whatcom Human Rights Task Force and chaired its board from 1997 to 2000. And he was also president of the board of the Northwest Coalition for Human Dignity, a regional human rights organization. We're going to start today with Dr. Johnson.
Can people hear me okay? I'm kind of long, and I'm a long distance away from everything, so. I was asked to talk about what civil rights laws mean historically and today, and I really think we want to talk more about what's been happening more recently, but I'm sort of gonna go back through some of this stuff because maybe it's worth, considering so that we can contextualize what's been happening more recently. Sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Wynant wrote an influential book back in the 1980s called Racial Formation in the United States. They talked about the civil rights era as the great transformation in the history of race relations in this country. From 1954 to 1970, the United States was transformed from a society governed by legal institutionalized white supremacy to one of legal racial equality. 1954 conveniently was used because it was the year of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, a U.S. Supreme Court decision which declared that legal de jure school segregation was unconstitutional. And the Brown case was the lead one of 5 cases that had been coming up about segregation in public schools from differing states that they just put all together and decided on at the same time. And of course, the sweeping decision that was made that day and the number of states that were involved made it a national decision around school segregation and by implication segregation in other walks of life. The Brown decision overturned, of course, the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which had said that separate accommodations and services were okay as long as they were equal, the infamous separate but equal doctrine. The rest of the period of the Great Transformation featured a courageous long-term set of campaigns of nonviolent civil disobedience to challenge the broader system of institutionalized segregation and white supremacy across the South. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56, which allowed Martin Luther King to become a person of national and then international prominence. The Little Rock, Arkansas school desegregation campaign of 1957 and 58. The sit-ins of 1960 and 1961, when originally college students in the South began to sit in restaurants and theaters and other places to break segregation in public accommodations. The Freedom Rides in 1961, where people on the buses and trains, challenged segregation in transportation systems. And all of this culminated in the March on Washington in 1963, at which over 300,000 people of all races marched in support of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which would come in 1964. It's important to note all of these events because the Civil Rights Act came nearly a decade after all of these campaigns of nonviolent civil disobedience in this country. So the stuff didn't happen overnight, and it would not have happened had not those courageous people been in the streets for all of those years. The movie Selma, which is at the theater right now, is important, and I would encourage everyone to go see it if you haven't already, because it chronicles the campaign for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the fact that most of the people in the movement were not satisfied with the passage simply of a Civil Rights Act in 1964, because they said that what good were all of these other loosenings of institutionalized racism if black people still couldn't vote and couldn't elect people who could represent them and pass public policies that would be in their interest. And so that last campaign, which ended up being quite brutal, really sped up, and I know the movie's been seen as controversial in many quarters. I won't say anything about that unless somebody asks me about it in the Q&A, but I think you should see it. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 is usually cited as the endpoint for the passage of significant civil rights legislation at the federal level. Little noticed, however, was the issuing of Executive Order 11246 in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson. That executive order mandated that employers take affirmative action to end racial and sexual discrimination in employment practices. Now, as we witness Republicans waxing indignant over President Obama's use of the executive order today, it's worthwhile to recall that 11246 was one of the most influential examples of presidential lawmaking in U.S. history. It was meant to specify the ways in which the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was to be implemented, and that's usually what the executive orders do. I mean, it is lawmaking, but it's micro lawmaking. And at the time, it wasn't considered to be a very big deal. But when you watch Selma, you can see that Johnson was under pressure to move more rapidly than the institutions usually move. And even after the Civil Rights Act passed, I mean, there was already racial rioting that had started to happen in the mid-1960s. The Watts riot would happen in August of 1965, and we know what the last half of the decade of the 60s was like in this country with respect to that issue. Now, fast forwarding, affirmative action, it came to be used not only in employment practices, but in public contracting. So contracting, government contracts to go out for people to do all kinds of work for the state or the federal governments or the municipal governments, and also in education and admissions to universities and so forth. So those are kind of the three areas that it came to be utilized in. The state of Washington overturned affirmative action in 1998 via the passage of Initiative 200 by voters. And it had already been overturned in California a couple of years earlier, and several states went on to introduce initiatives that usually passed over the years against affirmative action practices. The federal courts have gone back and forth on the issue. Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court, though, just last year, overturned affirmative action in higher education and I believe it's Shett versus the Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action in the state of Michigan, which upheld the 2006 Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, which was basically the same as the initiatives in California and Washington had been before. So affirmative action is, before that, was always still alive at the federal level because the Clinton administration defended it. And so if you were dealing with the state government, you had one set of problems. Like if you're a university, you're a state university, but if you have federal contracts and so forth and grants, then you still had to adhere to federal affirmative action law until last year. Now, in closer to home, in terms of K through 12 education, there was a Seattle case before the U.S. Supreme Court over racial preferences in the admissions to magnet programs in public schools, arts programs, science programs, and so forth. And it was a way to get, some of the upper middle class students to get into some of the buildings in other parts of town. I mean, Garfield High School, which is in the traditional black community in Seattle, has a few programs like this, and most of the students at Garfield are white today, and they routinely have more national merit scholars than practically any school in the state. But anyway, the court ruled, the U.S. Supreme Court, and there was also a Louisville case that was coupled with the Seattle case, that race could not be used as a tiebreaker for admissions in programs of that sort, that it was unconstitutional. Also, last year, the key sections of the Voting Rights Act were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. The section of the Voting Rights Act that required states to submit documents to the federal government before they could change their voting procedures, and these were 15 states, so mostly the old states of the Confederacy, that had very low voting levels before 1965. Let me just say, just to wind up, that, so that's all. One of the things we can say is that a lot of the civil rights gains have been rolled back or chipped away at, and people who are in favor of these changes would say that that's because, the country is very different today and we don't need all of that federal oversight. But the reason that we're here today having this conversation is because of the events of the last several months in places like Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown's case, and the case in Staten Island, Eric Garner's case, and so on. And what I will, and I'd like to, come back and talk about this during the Q&A. What I'd like to suggest to you that Americans, like many of you sitting out there, were shocked, especially with the Eric Garner case and the choke holding business and so forth. And I can't breathe 11 times, and they wouldn't stop, and the guy ended up being dead. And that's all on videotape. And then because the Ferguson stuff unfolded over several weeks with protests in the streets, it allowed us to take a look at race and law enforcement in this country. And the revelation for some of you that black men, and let me add Latinos, are routinely killed by the police in this country. Routinely meaning, in the dozens of communities that have sizable percentages of these populations, if you look at the whole country, from week to week, you're going to read about somebody black or somebody brown getting killed by the cops in circumstances that are controversial. And so then that makes us wonder how far we've really come. And so what I'll say is that the black community and the Latino community probably also has always had a tortured relationship with law enforcement in this country. And I'll stop, and maybe people will ask a few questions about where we might go from here.
We're going to do our presentations, and then we'll do questions, okay? Barbara.
Well, thank you. The question was, has the dream been fulfilled? And I was asked to speak on societal perceptions and attitudes concerning race. So since I teach in international studies at Western, it's difficult for me to contain societal perception regarding what is called race just to the United States and not look at a more globalized world. But Jane told me I had to. So, and
Really powerful.
And since this is the month that we celebrate Dr. King's legacy, I wanted to start with something Eugene Robinson had written in the paper on January 16th of this year. He said for Reverend King Jr., dreaming was not optional. It was a requirement for citizenship to envision a fairer, more prosperous nation. No longer shackled by racism and poverty, it was a duty to imagine a world no longer ravaged by senseless war. This was so clearly brought home to me when I was able to visit the West Bank city of Bethlehem and a Palestinian mediation center. When I walked into the center, the first thing I saw was a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King on the wall. And as a U.S. citizen, it was so clear that this man was the vision of the United States that people around the world hold up as the values, the integrity, they wish to emulate of the United States. Dr. King saw things very holistically. There was one humanity in this world. The issues of social justice that Dr. King considered so important imply fairness and mutual obligation in a society. If it is the election of one African American to presidency of the United States, signifying the perception we no longer have to dream or pay attention to what exactly that means, that what is fair and prosperous, we are in deeper trouble than we think. Dr. King certainly never stopped looking at the structural violence perpetuated by institutions inherent in our system. The institutional violence he paid attention to was not only race, it was poverty, and we are now at the point where half of the children in our school system in the United States live under the poverty line. It's classism, it's militarism, it's materialism, and he dreamed of one nation that no longer denied or delayed justice for all. Asking my students, the other day I asked my students, so do you think racism is prevalent in our culture, or you think it's done? You know, this is an overused term. They overwhelmingly said, are you kidding? You know, of course it's still here. And now, that's not exactly scientific. And so we turn to science, and I'm going to look at psychology and cognitive neuroscientists who now administer tests called implicit association tests. And they measure racial prejudice that we can't consciously control. So the tests ask you to rapidly categorize images of faces. And while you're categorizing these faces, they put up words like evil, good, harm, ugly, smart, you know, things like that. So you have these different faces. Those who think of themselves who certainly are not prejudiced, are often amazed at their score. Researchers suggest that the racially biased messages from our culture around us have shaped the very basic wiring in our brains. So University of psychologist Brian Nosek, who uses this implicit test, says that it's not about intent or desire, because we may not have the intent or the desire to harm anyone. We may feel that we are totally unbiased, yet when we take these tests, the bias comes out. It still occurs. So what psychologists are saying, this is an evolutionary function of our brain. We categorize. So, you know, tigers are dangerous, things like that. So what psychologists, researchers indicate is that we essentialize certain categories. It's a term often used, you know, we kind of call it stereotyping, but it's that we take any specific entity, an animal, a group of people, a physical object, whatever, and we put certain attributes on these people. And that's how we identify them, even if we don't, you know, if we consciously do not mean to do that. In other words, we assume certain categories. We assume certain people have certain characteristics. So through studies, I'm going to go through a few studies here, and Elsie Frankel Brunswick, who was working during World War II and after World War II, and she used cards to show animals, and she would start with one animal, and she'd use these cards that would change after about 3 or 4, and it'd be a different animal. And so what she found, though, and she used youngsters, and what she found is that the youngsters that had the most prejudice, they were very reluctant to move away from the original. They had that in their head, and that was the original object, and they could not move. So she realized this in 1949, and what we have now is this implicit association test that links these categories automatically for us. So like women are gentle, men are strong, you know, dogs are friendly, those kinds of things. So it appears to be how strongly one associates those social constructs that we've learned about people, about areas, et cetera, that seem to stick with us. So And this is thought that maybe this is like tribal identification. I mean, evolutionary-wise, we came from tribal. We needed safety in numbers. And it's a sort of a in-group, out-group sort of thing, that you had from high school. But other studies were also conducted, and it shows that even the slightest push toward behaving tribally, people happily comply. And so psychologists suggest that this is because, more than anything, we want to be connected and accepted as humans. That's how we survive. That's how we thrive. So there's other research that shows that this more essentialist way of looking at things, that actually people are less creative. The more essentialist they are, or the more stereotypical they are, they're less creative. And so what they did was take a group of people, and they didn't check to see, what prejudices they had or anything. They just gave each group different essays. One essay was talking about race, and basically it had all the stereotypes in it, et cetera. The other essay was a very non-essentialist, talking about race, and looking at race as a social construct. So then they took these folks and gave them a creative test. And what happened after that is the students, or the young people these weren't even young people, I'm sorry, the people who were the non-essentialists, that saw that essay, they actually had scored 32 points above the other group. And so what they came up with was that basically stereotyping and creative stagnation are rooted in the same tendency. In other words, an individual relies on these categories to give certain attributes, and it's hard for them to move away from it. So the last test I want to, just saw it, okay. Last test I wanted to mention was this weapons identification, because I think it is so important. But what they do is put a face, and then the person has either a tool, maybe a wallet, a gun in his hand. And you, as the person, have to push a button that says shoot or don't shoot. And this made people so upset, a lot of them quit, because they couldn't think fast enough, and the computer says you're too slow. It tells you you're too slow. But what they got out of this, whether they were civilian or police, it appears both groups were slower to push in the don't shoot button when the person presented was darker in complexion. So what researchers are trying to do is they're trying to get us to shift behavior. How do we go to a more complex, critical method of thinking? So, okay, I'm going to finish all this. Okay, I'm going to go to the last page, sorry. But, I mean, thinking of all of the three that Damani was mentioning, and the Tamara Rice, the 12-year-old that was killed, all of this. Basically, as an anthropologist, I guess, we take cultural assumptions and prejudices, and then we try to show that this is not so. You can find this group that isn't that way. It isn't this natural thing. But it's very hard to erase those when you're washed daily with these prejudices. So we've, come out of our life, out of our past, believing that we are innocent, that we are good. We don't do things to people to harm them. We're helping them. So even with acts of slavery and genocide, even those we're supposed to be civilizing the inferior race, this kind of manifest destiny, it was this massive base of racism and prejudice toward the non-white that's grown and found more growth. And was what Dr. King was saying. He went on to say the ultimate tragedy of Birmingham was not the brutality of the bad people, but the silence of the good people. What is it you want for this country? What do you want to leave your children, your grandchildren? What does integrity mean to you? Do we live in a nation that actually has integrity? What is the dream of fairness? I guess those are the things. But I want to just end with Jack Forbes, who's a Native American historian. And he says, well, living persons are not responsible for what their ancestors did. They are responsible for the society they live in, which is the product of the past. Assuming that responsibility provides a means of survival and liberation. We may not be there yet, but we do have the power to bring about the changes that can lift our nation to a fair and prosperous nation, which is what Dr. King dreamed about for all of us.
Thank you. Justice Jones?
The court has been concerned for many years with racial bias or any bias within the judiciary and the legal profession. As an institution and a branch of government, we recognize that we should provide and deliver that forum that is free from any racial, ethnic, religious, gender, or any bias whatsoever in our decision-making process. We've got to have that fairness and impartiality to assure that every citizen has access to the protection of their individual rights. Because we can't say we have a justice system, we can't claim it unless everyone's entitled to the same level of justice. And we know we're not delivering it, but we've recognized that for years and years, and that's why it's so important for us to work on those areas where we recognize improvements need to be made. So 25 years ago, the court created a task force to study that not only whether racial bias or ethnic bias existed in the court system, but was it perceived as existing in the court system? Because both are important. We can deal with the existence of it. We can't, and we have to deal with the perception of it. And as a result of the study, the court created the Minority and Justice Commission, which has been ongoing for 25 years now. I've been on the commission for 20 or 22 years. I've been chair of it, leading it for many years. Charged with the responsibility of doing two basic things. One, studying the court system, finding out where racial or ethnic bias exists, and taking positive and creative steps to eliminate it. Second, taking positive and affirmative steps to prevent it from occurring. We do that primarily through educational programs that we require judges to undertake. So you have a new trial judge, a new Superior Court judge here in Whatcom County this week. She's getting trained in things that will help her render fair and impartial decisions. Tomorrow morning, she will be undertaking a 3.5-hour program on cultural competency, so she knows that, or she gets the tools to deliver that, her rulings, and explain her rulings so they're not perceived to be biased in any racial or ethnic way. We have the rules that require judges and lawyers to avoid any hint of bias, and we have laws on the books that need to be fairly and equally applied. And the court system is that one institution where you're entitled to your fair day and your protection of your legal rights. And it's important to us as judges, and it's critically important to you to perceive us as being there for you when your rights are violated. So in the 25 years that the commission has acted, we've taken a lot of steps. We've adopted rules and educated judges and court staff, and we are in a better position today from all of those efforts we've undertaken over a period of time, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. And it always seems to be like climbing a mountain of sand. You put 1 foot up, you slide 2 feet back. But we're still working at it, and we're engaged in the conversation. So in some of the cases, we've decided how important it is. In a criminal case, rather serious criminal charge, the prosecutor alluded to the race of the defendant in a negative way, implicitly characterizing the defendant in a way that we felt and we found was inappropriate. We reversed the conviction and made him do it again. And this is in a case where they had the gun, the eyewitnesses, the confession, and it was all on videotape. So injecting any degree of race was unnecessary to the case, and the prosecutor was found to have violated what we required them to do in pursuing the charges against the individual, and ultimately the prosecutor, who was a veteran prosecutor, resigned because he was engaged in that conduct. So we've laid down the rules. We can't eliminate bias. We can't eliminate racism just by waving our big gavel over society. But We are engaged in those programs we think are helpful in continuing the conversation to get to that point. What really struck the Minority and Justice Commission and the court a few years back was a case that was filed in federal court where the claim was that the defendant who had been convicted of a crime was he was a victim of a racial bias that existed within the criminal justice system in the state. And there was a study by the University of Washington that drew that conclusion. We incarcerate a disproportionate and number of persons of color in our prisons, and that the justice system in the state is racially biased. That's what the study reflected and found, and the government didn't challenge that. My time is running out, but that generated a whole spark of new and interested activity, and
I can give it to my granddaughter.
yeah, someone knows how to turn this off.
I was so impressed.
Yeah. So one of the laws we need in this state is against selling smartphones to stupid people. But so let me finish by telling you some of the good things that we're doing, and let me focus on what we're doing in Whatcom County. There are certain programs where we're embracing a system of restorative justice so that people who come into contact with the criminal justice system are given tools to redirect their behavior in a more positive way. I allude to my own life story. In 7th grade, I had that person have that effect on me. I was going one direction, but for the intervention of a math teacher, I wouldn't be here today. And we need those programs to be supported. We know most of the county criminal justice system funding falls upon the county. Judge Garrett, who's here, and is a member of City Club, I think, can tell you, and I've been encouraged her to educate you about some of the good programs that we're dealing with kids. And that those programs need community support and involvement to try and redirect the behavior of kids who come into contact or under the radar screen of the police. Because if you don't redirect them, the predictability factors show they're going to get involved in more serious crime. If the system is perceived as being racially biased, you're going to get a group of folks that feel biased against. And what happens when that sense gets broader? You run into the situations that the professor talked about. You run into the Fergusons where an incident sparked national response. We had events in Olympia and Seattle, and you're not immune here. If you have a segment of your society who feels isolated and outcast, perhaps you'll have a response from that group that feels that they've been left out and they're being picked on. So we're engaged in that conversation. We need to broaden it. We need you to be aware of it. And there are a lot of good things going on. And I'm supporting those programs that exist in this county especially. And I hope to have the full support of the judiciary and the police force, and chief of police here is on one of my task forces and very supportive. So thank you.
Thank you. A lot to think about. I was listening to what you said about the mountain of sand. And I think, all of us can relate to that because we feel like we're right back where we started, listening to the same kind of things again. And this weekend there was a teach-in on racial equality at Seattle University, and one of the questions that was asked was, how is it that in the 21st century people still feel it necessary to declare Black Lives Matter? Why is Black humanity still in question? I'll throw it out to all of you. That's a big one.
The foundation of racism exists so prevalent. We're seeing it in disciplinary decisions made by school teachers when they have two kids and they're having a ruckus, and the teacher has to make a choice. to calm the situation down. Who am I going to kick out of the class? We're finding a racial bias exists within that decision-making process, and it starts the ball rolling. So we're getting, why it matters is those people are unaware, those teachers and perhaps the police are unaware of their inherent biases. So the discussion says, why does this matter? Is a conversation that needs to occur so people are aware of the decisions that they're making that have an influence on other folks. And I think the conversation needs to continue and broaden.
I might just add a little bit. I think if you ask anybody, do Black Lives Matter as much as anybody else's life, the answer will be, of course they do. But then when you, and you know what, one of the things that's a problem here is that the Department of Justice has been asking law enforcement agencies across this country for racial breakdown on the data of who police are shooting and killing since 1994, and we still don't have some systematic data, which basically means that police forces in general have been resistant to providing that information. So one of the things that we can say, at least from an empirical standpoint, about are cops killing black youth or black men more than anybody else is, statistically, we don't really know. Now, we have, certainly, this is where perception comes in, and the role of the police in certain kinds of communities versus their role in other communities. Most of you are old enough to remember the old Richard Pryor skit of, you know, when he's talking about it, he said, well, you know, the cops in your neighborhood is, oh, he's Officer, you know, McShaughnessy, you know, who, you know, over the white fence at the back of the, you know, barbecuing at night, and he's my neighbor, he's a great guy, you know. But the same officer in my neighborhood is somebody who, you know, pulls me over, you know, because I'm the wrong color, you know, driving too nice a car, so I must be a drug dealer. And you can very quickly find yourself out of the car and being slammed up against it. And in black communities and also Latino, I want to stress that a part of this conversation is that we haven't talked about the larger racial question in law enforcement so much. But in black communities, the police are perceived not to be friends, but to be enemies and often an occupying force. And so, and then in white suburban communities, people aren't exactly aware of what's going on, or they read about it in the papers, and then they hear about people like Eric Garner and Michael Brown who are resistant to the police at the very beginning of the day. And then so you've seen the data on perceptions about Michael Brown in particular, and most white people say that he shouldn't have resisted. He should have just got through the situation. And so nothing wrong happened to him for that reason. You know, he kind of had it coming to him. And with most, the black people will say, no, the system didn't work properly. There's something wrong happened to him. So you see the gulf in perception is great. And of course now the Michael Brown case is another one that, given the grand jury testimony, which was all over the place, we can say that we still don't really know what happened exactly. So I'm going on and I'm sorry.
I just want to say that I think our media and is still, in our nightly news and our constant wars are part of the problem, because do we ever fight anybody white? I don't know that of any wars very often. You know, Germany was the last one, I guess. But people we are fighting are dark. And I think that's, and the media, I think the media in our nightly news never gives you any analysis or understanding of what's going on. So I think it's part of the perception and the social construct that's created.
What part do you think, a lot of people would say that the real problem isn't racial, it's poverty? And we know that social stratification is true of all societies, but it seems like as the income gap widens today, it seems particularly strong around the racial divide. And how would you address that question? Is it poverty? Is it race?
Poverty is a huge component.
It is.
And we don't I was reminded the other day in a program by one presenter that the decisions that were made that contributed to the growing gap to go way back. And when we first came up with a federal program to assist people buying their houses, FHA or whatever the federal loan program was in the early 50s, it wasn't available to African Americans. So all the white people were able to get low interest not all the white people, I say, Caucasian people were able to get access to the programs and buy houses that were more valuable. And so over time, those more valuable houses at that time developed into better neighborhoods, and they're more valuable houses. And there was a segment of society which were excluded from that. And we're still paying for it. The opportunities are there, but few people are able to gain and catch up. So I think poverty is a huge component of it, and it's a societal issue. I don't know what the solution to, if there is one, but we have to recognize that there were decisions made that had a racial component to them 110 or 55 years ago that we're still seeing the effects of today.
I think the subprime mortgages are just a good example of that, too.
Do you think most people think that we've done enough, that we've made enough concessions and we've enacted enough laws and there's no reason for continued agitation for civil rights?
Well, I mean, I think, again, some polling data would suggest that most white Americans think that we've done enough, and people of color generally think that there's still more to be done. So, I mean, one of the things, and I know Barbara and I, and particularly Barbara, have been involved in work around, racial healing and having conversations about all of this. And I think that, where you have a perception gap, you can say, well, the black community is saying that the police are the enemy, and the police are saying, no, we're here to serve you and to help you. And the police can dig in their heels and say, well, we've decided that we're really here to help you and you guys just don't get it. But now, in this post-Ferguson situation, that's not going to work. The way the police behaved in New York City around Mayor de Blasio, Mayor de Blasio's a white man who's got a biracial son who looks black. So he said, yeah, I had to talk with my son. Cops didn't like that, but he's just talking, common sense to a young man that he doesn't want to get injured in interactions with the police, and turning their back on him and all that kind of stuff. That is going to eventually turn the public against them, and it's going to keep the protesters in the street, and people are going to demand to be heard. And so, as you said, where that perception is there, the institutions can't just, dig in their heels. They have to, accommodate, the people that they're supposed to be there to serve.
We've seen protesters in the street, but have we seen marches that are anywhere akin to the civil rights marches in the 60s? I mean, is there enough general outrage about this situation?
No, actually, let's see, Barbara and I both teach mostly international relations. Although I was riveted to the screen this summer over the Ferguson stuff. I mean, there were there haven't been as many or as large as there were in the 1960s. But again, you remember, that movement started in 1955, and it didn't reach its fruition until the mid-1960s. And we're only a few months into this thing. I mean, I think that the challenge is going to be for those who are concerned and who are activists to keep it in the public's attention. And there's some evidence that that's going on. I'm going to give a quick plug now, because I don't know how much more time we have. In the interest of keeping that conversation going, I mean, the students at Western had a program in the fall around post-Ferguson, and there have been some other things, and this is another good opportunity for the community. The Ralph Monroe Institute for Civic Engagement, which is housed in the Political Science Department at Western, of which I'm on the advisory committee. I didn't say that. My English professor, associate dean, that sentence wasn't constructed properly, Mark. I'm on the advisory committee of the Ralph Monroe Institute. We are having a civic engagement, law enforcement and civic engagement in the post-Ferguson era symposium at City Hall Chamber on March 4th from 6 to 9 p.m. And we already have Assistant City Attorney of Seattle, Craig Sims, and we have Veronica Galvan, who's another Latina new Superior Court judge who's a Western graduate in sociology from the Yakima Valley, is going to be on the panel. And James Bible, who's another, God, I can't believe they're all sociology majors.
So just tell us where we can find the information.
Well, I'm trying to say, we got local talent. Well, we haven't publicized it yet,
Okay.
but it will be
It'll
out in the
be
next
out there.
couple of weeks, on March 4th, and it's going to be a breakout session thing where there's opportunities to say, so where do we go from here, how do we take action?
So that leads to my next question, that it is education. Do you all agree that education is a big component of understanding the material that you talked about, or?
You know, I think education, but I also think the issues of bringing people together, you know, when they desegregated schools, that kind of thing, that was really important because you got to meet other people who were different. Can I go back? I want to go back to the economics for just a minute, because part of the reason Egypt blew up was that 50% of the young people are unemployed. And you have that in the ghettos in some of the areas of our city, urban areas too. You don't, you know, so somewhere along the line, you know, we're replacing robots, putting robots into places and leaving our people out. And I'm not quite sure what we think we're doing. You know, what is the purpose of that? It doesn't make any sense to me. You know, so. And that someone can make $1 billion, it still doesn't make sense to me. I mean, that does, you know, how safe can you be? How high can you build the walls? How many police do you need around your house? I mean, that doesn't make sense, you know, so it's like, anyway.
Okay. Yeah. So another thing that Barbara wanted me to point out was there's going to be a free movie at Community Cinema, free screening of The American Dream. So it's another educational opportunity. And of course, you already mentioned Selma, which I'm sure everybody would like to go see. So why, again, and I keep coming back to this because over and over we read these stories about about black teenagers, black adults being harassed or stopped in the street, the stop and frisk program. These people that would never happen to a white person. I mean, we've seen the hoodie in the white neighborhood. What happened to that young man? We saw the young boy that was killed that had a toy gun in the park. Would that have been a white person that would have been killed? Why does our society tolerate that? And what does what are our institutions saying about it? How do you talk about civil justice?
You can't eliminate crime. You can't eliminate violence. You can't eliminate people doing bad things to other people. It's never made sense, a lot of sense to me, some of the things that go on. We have to, though, be aware of again, the topic of racism, because we purport to have a fair, inclusive, equal society. And there are certain groups that just don't feel they've received their degree of fairness or equality. And having the conversation, I think, the recognition of what happened in Brown versus Board of Education, what happened when the marches in Selma occurred, gives us that historic perspective of where we started, or where some of the seeds of the discussions we're having today grew from. And they're a good discussion to recognize those seeds are still there. And we have to be vigilant. If we like this country and we like the concept that we're fair and impartial and equal, it doesn't come naturally. We have to work at it, and we have to be, I guess, culturally competent in our decision-making and our interactions with other folks. So I'm encouraged by the expansion of the conversation so we can recognize where we've come from, get a pretty good idea of where we might be and where we need to address certain things that we feel are necessary for the future, the direction of the change for the future.
I think I'm going to open it up to the audience now. And we're going to have 2 microphones. Chuck is over on this side of the room and Don on this side of the room.
We got one here.
Okay, go for it.
This is a question for Associate Chief Justice Charles Johnson. We've heard a little bit of talk about the implicit bias and the testing and the training. And one thing that I've understood and read about this training is that just by learning that you have it, that affects your future decisions. Just by accepting the fact that you do have this bias and seeing it in yourself, that affects your future decisions and reduces the bias. So the question is, do you support implicit racial bias training for judges?
Yes, that's one of the educational programs that we require all new judges to undertake. And it may, judges' responsibility when making decisions is not only to try to achieve fairness and impartiality, but they have to explain their rulings in a way that the parties understand why this side won and this side lost, and accomplish that in a way where each feels that they were treated fairly, even when they lose. And that's a horrible challenge for judges to achieve. Judge Garrett's very good at this, and she knows what I'm talking about, because people don't like to lose when they're in court. And we have adopted the code that controls the judges' behavior, and we train them and educate all the judges. And if they allow in that discussion, in their decision-making, in their interaction with the parties in front of them, any express bias, racial or ethnic or some other basis, they're going to be disciplined. So we've got a system in place to make sure we're striving to deliver justice in each case where the parties feel that their case was fairly decided, even when they lose. And it's a horrible challenge for judges to get across to the losing side that, you know, the law requires me to decide this case against you for these reasons. But if they do it with any hint of a racial tone or ethnic or any other bias that we preclude, then we have a disciplinary system for judges, and we use it.
You know, we live in a very violent country, and we don't always want to acknowledge it. But I wonder how it all relates to the fact our law enforcement uses weapons of war and weapons of war on the streets. And so it makes it much easier to have violent occurrences between the races so quickly. And I wonder what you see, if there's any connection here, and how we get past that to maybe address the real underlying issues.
Probably somebody else does, but you know, I have the question of why do police now shoot for the head and the heart? And why don't they shoot for the leg? I mean, that used to be the way it was.
Easier to hit.
It's easier to hit the body.
The body has bigger targets.
So what? I mean, you know, somehow they should be.
You'll slow him down then.
I know, that's what I thought, yeah. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me either that they because, well, it's sort of like our assassination stuff, you know. We've judged and we think that we can just go do this stuff, you know.
It is the honest desire of every police officer to never shoot their gun in the line of duty. And it's got to, and they're trained that way, to think of options. And when they pull that gun with the object of pulling the trigger, they have to be in a situation where they're convinced that that trigger needs to be pulled. And they're not going to aim for the knee. it's more serious than that. And I know a lot of police officers, and they fear that pulling the trigger incident, because they know that it's going to be, their lives are protecting someone else, and they don't want to do it. But they're trained on where that point is, and it's just not possible to maim someone. And I remember in one incident, I want to say it was in Seattle, it convinced me not to get a firearm. There was a policeman and a suspect, and they had a gun battle, and there were like 40 shots fired, and no one hit anyone else. So, and if the trained people can't shoot anyone, I don't need to have a gun in my possession. But so the challenge, hit him in the knee. If you can't, you got to hit him. It's hard to hit him anyway in those high anxious settings.
Question here?
Yeah, well, let's just keep going.
This is a nice, I think, partial follow-up, and really to what Barbara was saying, because I think our law enforcement are trained to not use their guns, for instance. But in the research that's showing that we are hardwired to see black men as threatening and scary, even black people see black men as threatening and scary, the research is showing what can be done about retraining these hardwired notions in our brain. That's what I'm, what can, does the research show there's things we can train police and teachers to have a different mindset?
Some of the research shows that the more you integrate, the more people know each other of different races, different cultures, et cetera, the less likely they are to judge them in that manner. And, when we first moved to Bellingham, I have to tell you that I said to my husband, I need to go down to Seattle once a month and just stand in the Pike Place Market, because I needed to hear those different languages, and because I came from the city. And I needed to see different colors. I needed to see different foods. It was really quite hard for me for a long time. And I just think if you grow up around that, and if that's much more available to you, you kind of dissipate some of that. But what the researchers say is if you can understand that you have that bias, then you can start asking the questions. You can start, wait a minute, what did I just do? Why didn't I say something right there? Those sorts of things. They're asking you to look at yourself and think about your own integrity. What is it you want to have happen, and why didn't you say anything when you just saw that incident happen? That kind of thing.
I disagree that we're hardwired. I think we're trained that way. Someone mentioned the media before. When I was a kid, the media's responsibility was to inform you of certain events. Today, the media's challenge is to inflame your emotions so you are outraged by what they are telling you in the story. And when they do that, they often cross certain lines to accomplish their purpose. The way to address that as an individual and as a group, get those groups that are being targeted by the media in whatever setting in front of you. We have a deep sense of fear or animosity or uncertainty about the Muslim religion. Have you invited the leader of the local mosque to come speak here to educate you? And same with the Sikhs and the other groups. It's education and a sense of, well, wait a second, they're not different. They're humans. We only have one race in this world, and it's the human race. We all share certain fundamental emotions, and it's only by being agitated and inflamed that we develop biases and prejudices.
Yes. Chief Justice, I was really glad to hear you mention restorative justice. I worked in juvenile courts for quite a few years here, and we had established a strong juvenile restorative justice program in a justice center that was really working, reducing recidivism rate. The biggest percentage of people in it were Native Americans, Hispanic, African Americans, as the same disproportionate numbers as we see in our jails and our juvenile system. But because they weren't state funded, state mandated, every program was cut by the county, and they no longer exist here. Because the state wasn't mandating these kind of programs. Are there ways, since you're aware that these programs do work well, to put pressure on our legislators to fund these kind of programs, the programs that are more proactive and that reach out and help the minorities in the community? And many are in the offender system, disproportionate to their numbers. So that's my question to you.
Well, and we've always had that battle. We know that restorative justice has a positive effect on a small group of folks, and this is a discussion, debate that drove the legislative decisions for the however many years you served down there. And do we want to build more prisons, or do we want to put more money in drug treatment and educational programs? And it's always this constant, where do we need? And we embraced many years ago a punitive model, saying we're just going to lock everyone up who commits a crime and don't care about them after they get out. So the pendulum is swinging back, I think, as far as governmental action, and I hope it does. And we do have more state funding and perhaps local funding. But you're a great testament to, in front of the county council, who bears the brunt of most of the funding of these programs. Judges are doing a lot. They're trying to institute drug courts, but those drug courts require community-based programming. We're doing alternatives to juvenile detention, and it's effective in those counties like here, where the detention population has been reduced from, let's say, 30 to 10. And we're only detaining the kids that need to be in there, and the other ones we're getting into programs. But you're right, we need this community-based support so those programs can deliver. And it's tough, and it's a balancing act, and it's a policy choice that the financial deciders have to make. Do we want to put more money into the police force, the fire department, the public safety, or do we want to put them into programs that help people who have committed crimes or might commit crimes? That debate goes on constantly in every governmental forum I've ever associated with, from the city to the county to the state. If you like those programs that you were active in, go to your city council meeting, go to your town council meeting. Oh, you are? Okay, well, sing that, continue to sing that song and convince your others, and take them out to see the juvenile detention alternative program in Whatcom County and the good things that's doing. And the drug court.
We have one over here.
We've heard our panelists talk about racism, bias, and implicit bias in our media, in our culture, and in our justice system. But when that happens in our criminal justice system, we see deaths and use of deadly force. And what leads to that is the bias. It's the racial profiling. Do you think that then it's imperative for all law enforcement to take implicit bias and diversity training, as well as collect the data and have civilian oversight of all of those things? And we hear about this problem nationally, but we should also be aware that that happens here locally in Bellingham and Whatcom County. We have 1.2% African American population, but the arrest rate for Black Americans is 5.4 in Bellingham and 4 in Whatcom County wide. And in the jail population, 5% of the jail population is Black, and 18% is Native American, even though they're only 3.2% of our population. So we have a problem here as well.
Is there a question?
Well, I think the question was, do we believe in diversity and bias training? And I think the Justice already answered that.
Yes.
Is there other questions? Here. Dawn? Yeah.
Thank you. Each of you speakers alluded to the fact that we all have an unconscious bias that we carry with us. And you've all alluded to the importance of education. And I'd like to know if any of you are familiar with the concept of white privilege, and specifically with, and I'm not carrying a candle for a particular individual, but I would commend to everyone here the sea of almost exclusively white faces. There's an excellent lecture that was given some years ago by a man named Tim Wise at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and pretty much all white, rich girls, Ivy League school, on white privilege. And most of us white people have no idea, no concept of how we take things for granted that people who are non-white don't take for granted. And I'd like to know if you're all familiar with that, and if so, if you endorse that. Thank you.
Well, I think, this is not news. I think most of the people, I'm going to have confidence in this audience that most people are familiar with the concept of white privilege. Now, it's a question about whether or not you accept it. It's a reality, but it is a reality. And it's like you said, that white Americans just take so much for granted. And one of the reasons that, you have to say Black Lives Matter is because, when you go through your day-to-day routine, you don't come up against the kinds of situations that people of color often do. I mean, when I was younger and had a head of hair, when I started teaching at the university, I'm tall, and you go to the faculty club on Friday afternoon, and they say, "So, are you with the athletic department?" I mean, that happened more than once. And if I was out in public, actually, my wife back there finally got tired of me saying, when people say, "Where do you work?" I'm up at the university. Say, "Why don't you just tell them you're a professor?" Because I actually had one guy step back and scratch his head and said, "What do you say you do?" And she stepped in. She said, "He's a professor, buddy. Get it?" Because black people don't teach in universities, right? The stereotype of university professor is still a white male, and so white people are privileged in all those kinds of ways, and so you can be indifferent that there's another group of people that are having different kinds of problems, not only with law enforcement, but with the whole system of institutions that white people just don't normally have. So it's something that people should, Peggy, what's her name? Unpacking the White, what's her name? I'm getting too old, I can't quote things as easily.
Unpacking the knapsack, isn't it?
Unpacking the White Knapsack. Anyway, all the kinds of things that you take for granted that, black people, you move to Bellingham, you can't get hair care products. It's all that kind of stuff.
And that's why you lost your hair.
Yeah, that's right. I just got rid of it, yeah.
Do we have time for one?
In all the discussions here, there's been an assumption that somehow it is achievable to eliminate prejudice in decision-making. The idea that if you just learn enough or you try hard enough, you can rid yourself of prejudice. And I think that's completely wrong, and I'm willing to bet that you'll agree with me. She's nodding her head. And I think that what's very important is to accept the fact that we are prejudiced and that we will always behave and make decisions in a prejudiced way and go forward from there, rather than assume that we can be free of prejudice. And what I would offer, this is not as serious as prejudice, racial prejudice, but the prejudice against, in favor of beautiful people versus unattractive people, and the enormous difference that it makes in lives, shows that it's everywhere. It permeates everything we do. So rather than imagine that we can reach a place where we're free of prejudice, perhaps we need to incorporate prejudice as part of how we think we make decisions. And I guess I'm just interested in what you think of that idea.
Would you like to answer?
Actually, not all societies are as judgmental as we are. And I think that partly what happens is when you've lived narrowly, without a lot of diverse people around you, that you end up being more fearful of others. So I have to say that, you know, I think you're absolutely right. I think everybody should have this training, the unpacking the white knapsack, that kind of thing. I think that's absolutely so. And it's, you know, as long as you have some ability to critically analyze, okay, I don't really like that person. I don't have to spend my time with that person. Or you can be kind, but not try to take, I don't know, what is it? Not try to do something to harm that person. And I think there are a lot of societies. There's an old film called My Little Village. It's a Czechoslovakian film. And the thing about that film that I loved was just basically that everybody in that village had a purpose, even those who had disabilities. They all had a purpose and they all were respected. But we somehow just immediately don't respect what isn't like us. And I don't know why we have that so much.
Here's the way.
It's because we're prejudiced
Oh,
naturally.
you guys were prejudiced. Okay, sorry.
You have the last
Sorry.
I agree.
You may be right, but here's the way I deal with it, and it's especially true with kids. And it goes back to the anecdotal story I told about my life and the person who came into it and changed the direction of my life. You don't know that kid you're dealing with, or you come in contact with, if pushed in the right direction, may be the person that finds a cure for the disease that your daughter or son or relative or spouse is suffering from. You don't know. So you want to give them every benefit of the doubt as an individual and every chance to succeed, because they may be the one, and you don't know. That's how I deal with it.
That's a great place to end this discussion today. I'm sorry that the time is up. We hope you'll continue to talk about these issues with your friends and your children, and especially your grandchildren, and not just on Martin Luther King Day. We have a small gift for our three panelists, and please join me in thanking them for being here today.